Thanks for having me.
I'm Mary Pollinators. I'm with Township Parks and Recreation. We have two of our commissioners here. Joe Hutchins is in the back, the guy looking out the window. And Joe's actually been a commissioner here for 29 years, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then next to him is James Wright. And James is going to be running again for park commissioner. So you might want to keep him in mind when you're filling out your ballot. And Brenda in the back is one of our workers through Michigan Works, and we are thrilled that she's still here. And in the very back as well is Donna Boschel. And Donna Boschel is the president of the Northwest Oakland Bee Association. And if you look out the back windows, those two big hives that say Nova at the top, during the summer they will have a bunch of bees in them. And Donna is an expert beekeeper, and she has been involved in these bee associations across the bee association comes here every second Sunday of the month for their bee meetings. So if anybody is interested in raising bees, you might want to sit in on some of those meetings and learn about them. So we'll let Cole go ahead with his program, and thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. So obviously we're talking about pollinators today, and we're going to talk about issues with some of our endangered and threatened pollinators again, like similar to last time. And we're also going to talk about pollinator gardens and a couple other things. So we will, because I think everyone or most people is here, I'll kind of do this a little bit quicker than last time. So I'm Cole Fisher. I recently graduated from Michigan State University with a degree in plant biology. I did a lot of research. I worked in greenhouses and horticulture, so a lot of different plant research, and then some other research as well. And now I'm the Imperiled Species Education and Outreach Intern with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So my job is to give these presentations, teach people about our threatened and endangered species, about our careers, which we did last time I was here, and yeah, just generally come out and do a lot of outreach. So a little fish and wildlife background. Again, I think a lot of you saw this already. Some examples of jobs you might be able to do out in the field, tagging, banding birds, or working with marine mammals. Generally, we just get to do a lot of really cool outdoor work and get to go to a lot of really interesting places. Even in Michigan, we do a ton of really interesting work. The Endangered Species Act is what we work through in my program. And so these are all or not all, but these are a grouping of the species that we cover in Michigan. So we have some mussels, we have bugs, like pollinators, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, birds. We kind of cover everything. And today we'll focus on the pollinator side of that. So what even is a pollinator? Obviously, some of you know, some of you might not. Pollinator is really anything that helps move pollen from one part of a flower to another. So it doesn't have to be a bee, it doesn't have to be a butterfly, but definitely not something like a cat. It's not really a squirrel. They're not pollinating things, but we do have a lot of really cool pollinators in Michigan. So pollination, like I said, is moving pollen from one flower or one part of a flower to another. And so the way that this generally works with insect-pollinated plants is a bug, a bee, a fly, or something goes into the flower and is trying to drink the nectar, which is generally like at the base. While it's doing that, it's rubbing up against the male part of the flower, just like here and here, and it's getting pollen on its, mostly like the hairs on its back. Sometimes it's also collecting pollen intentionally, which we can talk about a little bit. And then that same insect or whatever it might be that's getting into the flower goes to a different one and rubs against the female part of the flower and lets some of the pollen off of its body, and that's how the pollen is transferred, and then eventually a seed and fruit comes from the flower. Seeds, but insects and maybe some birds or butterflies are not the only things that pollinate. Wind and rain also are pollinators in sort of a sense. A lot of flowers release their pollen without anything agitating it, just out into the wind, and that's where like seasonal allergies mostly come from. is plants just releasing pollen into the atmosphere, into the wind, and it's blowing us to basically find another flower. So generally, those plants are producing a lot of pollen, and their pollen structures are a lot larger sometimes than flowers like this that have an insect or something that actually has to physically make contact with the pollen. And then, yeah, so wind and rain dropping onto a flower can kind of splash some pollen up sometimes too. Similar thing. Pollinators are super important because we need seeds for flowers to grow food. Something that's overlooked a little bit is animal feed. So maybe in 4-H or in this kind of a setting, we know that animals eat a lot of food. A lot of people don't think about that, but all of that food needs pollinators too. So that's super important for humans, and then also just for the environment in general. All the wild animals need food, so pollinators kind of keep our whole system running. So some pollinators that you might have seen or you might have in your backyard, the western honeybee, that I'm sure our beekeeper friends maybe can talk about, but that is a super common bee that you might see around here. The common eastern bumblebee, that is one I believe I have in our box over there. Probably the most common bee, especially in like southeast Michigan for this state. When you get up into the UP or into northern Michigan, we have a couple other types of bumblebees that are probably a little bit more prevalent, but generally down here, if you see a bumblebee and it looks pretty normal, it's probably just the common eastern bumblebee. We have a confusing furrow bee, which is a really small bee. I might have one of those in the box over there, but those are generally like super small. If you saw it, you probably wouldn't immediately think, oh, that's a bee, which is kind of interesting. We have a ton of different ranges of sizes, thinking like something from a sweat bee that is a bee, and then all the way up to huge bumblebees that are the size of a quarter and super heavy. But then all other pollinators, maybe a monarch butterfly. That is one that we have that is proposed for listing and is also just another good example of a pollinator. Butterflies, some birds we have are pollinators, some bats can be pollinators, especially in more tropical places. So a lot of different options here. Other pollinators in your yard that you probably don't see as much because they need very specific habitats. All of these are threatened and endangered species. So these are things that, as the Fish and Wildlife Service, we protect and we research, and a lot of people are doing a lot of really important work on. The rusty patch bumblebee, it looks pretty similar to a common eastern bumblebee or a lot of the other bumblebees that are not threatened or endangered, but it does have the really distinctive kind of red right here on its back. And so that little patch of rust is where it gets its name, and there's really not very many sightings of it in Michigan. I think at one point we did think it was not in Michigan anymore, but since then we've found it a couple times. The Mitchell-Sader's butterfly. That's an endangered butterfly that we also have in Michigan. There's for all of the butterflies, there's a lot of really interesting captive rearing efforts going on at our zoos, specifically John Ball Zoo. I'll actually be there tomorrow for a meeting about butterflies, and they do a lot of work basically breeding and growing butterflies in captivity, and then releasing them hopefully into the wild with help from people like the Fish and Wildlife Service to kind of boost their population. So that's one of our really interesting species. The Powesheik skipperling, that's these two right here. They're kind of in the same boat. They're threatened and endangered, and so same kind of work is going into them, and then same thing with Carner blue. And we'll get into all of these a little bit more specifically now. So the rusty patch bumblebee, like I said, is endangered. It's a generalist, so basically any flower that has a decent amount of pollen or is regularly used by bees, the rusty patch bumblebee is also going to use. This was the first bumblebee to be listed as a threatened or endangered species, so it's the first bee that the Fish and Wildlife Service protected. And we have a bunch of threats for it. Pathogens, so something sometimes we don't think about is insects. like no matter the size, can also get diseases. They can also have like bacteria and viruses. So those kinds of things can really impact bees. Again, especially when you're beekeeping and you have a lot of bees in kind of a smaller space, pathogens are something that we definitely worry about. Same thing for our native. We were talking about this a little bit before we started the presentation too, but generally the use of pesticides for agriculture or home use can impact different bee and insect species in general. So we want to limit our use of pesticides when we can. And then habitat loss and degradation, that's kind of similar to a lot of our endangered species. If we take away the places that these animals live, then they can't live there. And then we have some non-native and managed bees can actually be competition and can definitely impact the rusty patch bumblebee and our other native bumblebees. So like I said before, the western honeybee it's not actually a native bee to Michigan. It's really common because beekeepers keep it, and so they're flying around a lot. But they were introduced to Michigan, and so those can be competition for our native bees, and they can outbid bees, especially when they're more specialized or they have really small populations. So that's definitely something to look out for. And having that many or that high of a quantity of introduced bees in a place can introduce more things like pathogens. So that's just something that we kind of worry about. And then small population biology, I will get into with another species. So for the rusty patch, the habitat, prairies, woodlands, marshes, it also can live kind of just at parks and gardens. Like I said, they are generalists, so they're going to be found on a lot of different types of flowers. Basically, anywhere that's going to have a flowering plant, you might be able to see it. You won't see it because there's not that many, but they could live there. And they're solitary bees, so like a lot of native bees in Michigan, I actually don't know of any that form like a hive. Most of them are solitary and they burrow either into the ground or into trees or different types of like wood or plants. And so this bumblebee is one that uses abandoned rodents' nests as its home or other mammal burrows. So instead of making its own burrow, it will go underground. They are solitary, but they can sometimes kind of cohabitate and live with other rusty patch bumblebees or other bumblebees in the same burrow, but they don't have the same social structure that when we think of like traditional bees that we're raising for honey. They're not really like doing the dances, they're not communicating, they're kind of just living on their own and going about their own day and not paying attention to the other bees around them. So that's something that's really cool and often overlooked. These bumblebees actually do have queens, so a lot of the other native bees in Michigan, they don't necessarily have a queen. All of the female bees are reproductively active and all of the male bees are reproductively active. This one is a little bit different because they actually do have a queen, but when you think about, again, like the bees that we introduce or the bees that we keep, you're looking for like a nice healthy queen that you're trying to keep alive so that you can have bees the next year. These are reproducing just kind of like any other animal in the wild, and they don't need one specific individual to keep their population going. But queens for these type of bees do overwinter in loose soft soil under like leaf litter usually, and they don't necessarily go down as far as their regular nests. They're right under the soil and they can just dig themselves down in there on their own every winter. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later too. This is a Carner blue butterfly. This is definitely one of my favorite species that I get to work with or work on. I guess I would say work on their kind of habitat and work on their reproduction and things. So they're endangered as well. They are a specialist, so they only used wild lupin as a host plant. This basically means that when you have like the baby caterpillar for the Carner blue butterfly, it's going to need lupin, and the adult is only feeding really on lupin. So they're not going to other flowers, and this makes it really challenging to keep them alive and keep their population going. But they do pollinate. They're going to other plants, but they're using lupin as their like food source, I guess I'll say.
Cole, you may not know it, but we actually have a native population of lupine.
Yeah, and I see the picture in the back there too of the lupin. So that's really good, and that's kind of what we're trying to increase, and I'll talk about that too. First, you'll notice that the male butterfly and the female butterfly look different. That's called sexual dimorphism. So that's basically just when the population needs to tell itself apart from the males and the females, and they have different characteristics to do that, especially for like mating, is a big reason that you might have a dimorphic population. So the males are generally like that bright blue color, that is where the name comes from, and then the females are kind of this more muted brown kind of color. So that's something that when we're doing surveys and things, we have to look out for, and we can track not only like the population size for the butterflies total, but we can also track the percentages of male to female and kind of look at their population that way, which is really interesting. Butterflies are really hard to get exact counts for because they're always flying around, so that's something that we deal with too. But then also something that this butterfly has to deal with is climate change, especially when we're talking about the wild lupin. There's a lot of like kind of mismatched areas where the butterflies might be able to exist in that specific climate, but the lupin can't grow there. And so that's something that we're trying to look at is can we move the lupin that's not spreading to the areas where the butterfly are fast enough? Obviously, the plants can't like get up and fly there like the butterflies can. So if the butterflies need to be in a more sheltered area or a colder or warmer area, the plants might not already exist there. So that's something that we're kind of looking at is reintroducing lupin to a lot of these like kind of up and coming habitats. And then the butterfly's eggs are also susceptible to temperature-induced hatching. Temperature-induced hatching is just like in the spring. When it gets warm enough, the butterflies hatch, and that's the temperature tells them when it's time to come out. If we have swinging temperatures, especially early springs, then we get an early hatch and there could be another frost, which could kill a lot of the butterflies, or the flowers might not have emerged yet. So if it gets too warm too early, the flowers might not have started growing, but the butterflies might be out, and then they're not really going to have that food source like I was talking about again. These butterflies also have two flights, which means they like come out at two different times. They hatch at two different times. So their second flight is in the summer. And extreme heat and extreme droughts in the summer can not only kill the butterfly directly, but again, if we're getting extreme droughts and the lupin dies, then those butterflies aren't going to have a food source. So that's something that's kind of interesting. And I can talk about this more if anyone has questions too about this butterfly specifically. It's a really complicated one, and there's a lot of work going into it, which is pretty cool. Like I said, we're limited to places where only wild lupin grows, and that's also generally like oak savannas and pine barrens. So it's this kind of scattered trees with a lot of open space. The butterflies also don't like an overstory generally. They're not ones that are going to be flying through the woods. They like a big open field. So that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're managing their habitat as well. Now the Mitchell-Sater's butterfly, this is another super cool butterfly. It's endangered, and it's another one that's a little bit more of a specialist. So sedges are essentially like kind of like a type of grass. In the plant world, there's a lot of different characteristics that we use to tell them apart, but for like the general use, you could say that sedges are like grass, and that's what these butterflies are using as their host. So when they lay their eggs and have their larvae, they need to be on certain types of sedges and sedges in general. So that is limiting where they can reproduce as well, which is part of the reason that they're becoming endangered. And then they pollinate a lot of wildflower species, so they're not using the sedges as a food source because grasses and sedges don't really have like showy that they're going to get nectar from or something like that. So they're using other wildflower sources as their food, and that's how they're pollinating. And they're using the grasses when they're in their larval stage or when they're caterpillars, and they're eating the sedges as their food before they turn into a butterfly, essentially. So they also need a very specific habitat. They need a variety of grasses and sedges in the area, but they need this kind of like wetland habitat. So a prairie fen is kind of shown up here, and then a tamarack swamp is down here. Tamaracks are a type of tree, and generally both of these places are not like a traditional swamp that's, always super like muddy, or there's like a lot of cattails growing up or something like that, you can kind of see they're a lot lower. There's not like a big canopy or anything. They're pretty out in the open. So again, that's just something that butterflies tend to like, or at least these butterflies tend to like. Prairie fens are also fed by groundwater that's like seeping up from a spring, so they're wet all the time, and that's different than a lot of other wetlands that maybe are wet seasonally, so something for us to keep in mind as well. This is the Poweshiek skipperling. This one is really fun. They're kind of a lot smaller butterflies, and they get their name because they do just like skip around super quick. So they might be in one area and you are watching it, and then all of a sudden it's over here on another flower and you like didn't even see it move. So that is something that's pretty cool about them. They are also using a couple different host plants. These are types of grasses, and this food source when they're a larva or when they're a caterpillar, and they're only using these specific ones. So if these grasses don't exist in an area, they can't live there or they won't survive there. And they mostly pollinate black-eyed Susans, or that's one of their kind of favorite plants. So that's another thing that we look for when we're thinking about maybe reintroduction or what makes a good habitat for them is we need this specific mix of grasses and black-eyed Susans in the same area so that they can kind of live there. The plowed native prairie fens, so similar to last time, some of it's kind of a wetlandy area, but a prairie is just like, again, a wide open field, and it's going to have these grasses and different types of flowers in it. A lot of these get turned into agriculture, or historically they were turned into agriculture, so that's another reason that some of these species may be declining is just the destruction or removal of their habitat. Yeah, they're pretty interesting. So what even makes good habitat for pollinators in general? Now moving a little bit away from our endangered pollinators. We want a lot of shapes and colors. We want biodiversity, which means as many different types of plants and animals as possible. And size isn't necessarily a huge restriction. A lot of butterflies don't need a ton of area, and especially when we're thinking about a garden, some garden is better than no garden. So obviously, here in the parking lot, we don't have any plants, so pollinators are not going to be there. There's nothing for them to eat. There's no flowers for them to get nectar from or pollen from, so they're not going to be there. Grass in a big open field, maybe like a soccer field or something, ton of plants, but it's all the same plant that multiple pollinators are going to use, if any. This is essentially the same as the parking lot over here, even though it's all made of plants. And then here in the middle, we have a nice pollinator garden. It has ton of different types of shapes and colored flowers. There's tall flowers and short flowers, and things for pollinators to look at and kind of be drawn in by. So that's what we want to see. Now thinking about our pollinator garden again, what do we need to grow a plant? We need sun, we need light. We're not needing really like food for plants. We don't have to feed them anything. They can eat off of the soil, and we need water. And so those are just good things to look out for if you're looking in your yard. If you're a plant, like, are you getting enough light standing here in this spot? Not all plants are the same. That's a good thing to keep in mind. You can plant things in your yard that can fit the needs or fit the criteria that you already have. It's not like you need to dig up your whole yard and change the elevation or change where the water is or something. You can find plants that'll suit your area. So we will, there we go. Where to plant our garden. Open soil with a lot of space. Maybe it has some grass, easy to remove. We can always just take some of the grass out. And we want soil that's moist but not muddy. It's a lot easier for plants to grow where there's a little bit of water, especially when we're going from a seed, or maybe we just planted them new. They need a lot of water to help them grow. But we're not really planting them in like a swamp where they're going to drown in the water. So that's something to keep in mind. Like I said, sunshine. But then something for a pollinator garden to keep in mind is if it's near other trees or bushes, there might already be pollinators in that area. They might be used to coming to that certain tree, that certain bush that has a lot of flowers on it or something, or is good habitat for them. So planting it near other plants can kind of be helpful to introduce them to the area and make sure that they're actually using it. And then something for humans to think about when we're planting these gardens is, can we actually maintain it? Can we take care of it? I don't want to plant a garden that is like a mile from my house down the road, because I'm never going to go walk out there with my watering can or something. I want to be able to water it and weed it easily and plant new plants when I can. So something to think about when we're planting our gardens. Now, in terms of choosing plants, this is super important. As kind of a plant guy, this is really important to me. We want native plants. So just like we don't want non-native or invasive animals coming in, we also don't want non-native plants coming in. They can take over an area, they can outcompete other things, but also native plants mean that we're going to get native pollinators. When we think about how our landscape has evolved over like the millions of years that pollinators have been around, they evolved with the flowers and with the native plants in their area. So if you were to take a pollinator from Europe maybe and just drop it here, it probably isn't going to do as good, just because it's not used to the types of flowers we have. It might not know what to go to first. They probably have different structures and different colors. So those are all things to think about. We want plants that are native to the place that we're in, so that the pollinators that are native to here can also use them efficiently. And then we want different shapes and sizes. Like I was saying, pollinators are, they're actually kind of visual, so they're looking at all the flowers, especially bees, and they see in a different color spectrum than us, which is interesting. They see ultraviolet light, so they're looking for inflorescence or fluorescent colors, and so something that we might not be able to see, they could see, which means we just want to plant like a bunch of everything so that something is drawing them in, if that makes sense. And then we also want to kind of group flowers and plants together so that the pollinators don't have to fly across your yard or across a barrier to get to the next plant. We want them to just be able to skip from flower to flower. That makes it a lot easier. Even some butterflies, they won't like cross over a wide open yard. If there's no plant for them to jump to, they just won't fly over there. It's like you have a big wall up. Or if you have a fence and it's mowed right along the fence and there's a little gap in your yard, they might not even cross that, just because they think that if they fly over there, there's going to be nothing for them to eat. So it's just like a wall that they won't cross. So that's something to think about too. Here are some examples of native plants from the Midwest that are really great for pollinators. And it's really nice to think about different blooming times. So for us and for the pollinators, we want to see flowers all year round. It's not super great when everything is growing and green in the spring and your garden is still dead, or when things are starting to die off in the fall. It's really nice for us to still have flowers out there. It makes it look a lot better. So pollinators also like this. When they come out of their kind of winter hibernation, they want to immediately go to a flower. They need a lot of energy in the spring, so it's important for us to have food for them in our gardens right when they come out. And then when everything else is dying off, we want to make sure that they can still eat, they can still stick around in the area, and so we want to have like late blooming flowers in the fall as well. In these pictures, that is red columbine. That's a really nice spring blooming flower. Wild bergamot, that is a really popular choice for bees in general. Bumblebees really love wild bergamot. And then this is showy goldenrod. So this is something that you probably see all the time, but it's also something that we can plant purposefully if we want pollinators. It's super popular in the fall because the flowers last a really long time and provide food for the bees and butterflies and everything well into the fall. Another thing that sometimes we don't think about is buildings for pollinators. Bird baths are really great, and pollinator drinking stations that can even be made out of a bird bath are really nice because pollinators need water. Bugs still drink water. Butterflies definitely like to have water around. Birds, like hummingbirds that also can sometimes do pollination, they like to have water around. So having one of these little trays, or again, you can make this in a stand in a bird bath, and putting some rocks in it, and making sure that there's places that the pollinators can land in the water, and then they can kind of get right down to it and drink out of it is super important. If you have kind of a bird bath with nowhere for them to land in there, they still can't really use it because they can't swim. So that's something that we can think about. And then also changing this water like semi-regularly is really important. Cleaning it every once in a while, making sure there's nothing bad growing in there. You're not getting, like mosquito eggs or something in there. And then also that's like reducing our pathogens like we talked about earlier, any of those like bacteria or viruses that might be in the water from all the pollinators coming there. We want to kind of flush that out so that everyone stays healthy. Also bee houses. These are becoming a lot more popular, so you may have seen some. But like I said, a lot of our native pollinators, our native bees are solitary. They don't build their own nests. And these are really good for cavity nesters. In the wild, they'll find like a stick or a hollow stem of a type piece of grass or something, and they basically burrow themselves in there, and that's where they live, is inside that little hole. So this is basically just taking that spot, and they can stay right in our garden. That better habitat for them, especially if we don't have a ton, like a big field or woods behind our house. This is a great way to like make sure that they have somewhere to live in the winter. Another thing that we can do is take care of our garden. We want to make sure that everything's growing. Like I said, clean our bird baths and our pollinator watering stations so nothing bad is getting. But one thing that's really important that I like to try to do is leave all the leaves that fall in the fall. I feel like I just said the same word 4 times, but we want to leave them on the ground. We want to, because that is habitat for pollinators. They need to live underneath the leaves. And like I said, they kind of burrow into the soil, but that provides them insulation so they don't get so cold in the winter, especially like this year, what was it, -30 wind chill. And so those pollinators, some of those bees are probably not going to make it through that if they don't have a nice thick like blanket of leaves over top of them. So we want all those leaves to stay on the ground. If we do need to rake our yards, sometimes it's not an option to not do that. It's nice to leave them maybe like along your back fence line or something like that. You can leave a layer, and that's going to be super important for